You know what an Exterminatus order looks like from above. The orbital platforms rotate into position. The cyclonic torpedoes drop. A world is reduced to cinders from the stratosphere down in hours, and the Imperium records this in formal High Gothic, stamps it with 17 seals, and files it under necessary measures. Mercy of a kind. What the Imperium does not record is what was happening on the planet that morning. A few hours before the first torpedo hit the upper atmosphere, someone on that world brewed a cup of recaf. Crushed leaves, hot water, the Imperium's equivalent of coffee, a mild stimulant consumed across 1 million worlds every day before the first shift starts. Someone poured it, drank it, said their prayers before leaving the door. Someone caught a transit. Someone argued with a spouse. Someone, somewhere near the spire districts, spent the better part of an hour getting dressed. That is what today is about. The Imperium of Man spans roughly 1 million inhabited worlds. On most of them, people wake up, put on clothes, eat something, pray, commute, work, pray again, come home, sleep, and repeat until they die. That cycle, that thoroughly human, almost recognizable cycle, is one of the setting's most underexplored facts. Because the texture of that survival, the way the daily routine is structured and controlled and surveilled from birth to death across 1 million different environments, tells you more about what the Imperium of Man actually is than any battle catalog ever could. Not the Space Marines, not the Primarchs, not the great campaigns that fill the official histories. The commute, the ration, the prayer you say before breakfast, not entirely because you want to, but because someone will notice if you don't. Let's start with the worlds that feel most like home. The Imperium officially classifies planets as civilized worlds when their development has been allowed to progress naturally over millennia without any specific economic or military purpose imposed on them. No forge master demanding a particular industrial output. No hive administration managing population density for extraction efficiency. Just a planet with a functioning society and the Imperium's moderate but unignorable hand resting on its shoulder. These worlds are, by the Imperium's own reckoning, the most common type of settlement in the galaxy. Billions of people living in urban centers supplied by their own agricultural regions, governed by whatever political arrangements they've developed over time. Some organized as planetary nation-states, others as power blocks, others as tribal confederacies that have achieved enough internal stability to keep the lights on. The Imperium generally allows civilized worlds to manage their own affairs. The tithes are paid, devotion is maintained. Within those two constraints, life proceeds with a latitude that most other world types don't get. The official comparison, in multiple sources, is early 3rd millennium Terra, roughly equivalent to the world the setting's designers were imagining when they built it, even if they were sitting in the late 20th century when they did. Cities, vehicles, commerce, banking services, urban sprawl. A society with enough surplus purchasing power that not everyone's daily activity is directly tied to immediate subsistence. The implication of that 21st century equivalent framing is that the supporting infrastructure exists too. Retail, trade, the economic machinery that a functional consumer society generates around itself. Whether any specific civilized world looks exactly like that, or whether one looks like a medieval city-state while another resembles a late industrial megacity, varies. Civilized worlds are explicitly described as split into geographical regions with widely differing technological and cultural development, even within the same planet. What this produces at street level is something you might almost recognize. Someone going to work in a vehicle, someone buying food in a market, someone banking, trading, doing the things that people do on planets where the economy has developed past subsistence and toward something more complicated. On some worlds in the 41st millennium, the daily commute genuinely involves a car. The horror of that isn't immediate. It arrives later, through accumulation. The thing that grounds daily life on a civilized world before anything else is recaf. It shows up everywhere in the setting, in guardsmen field rations, in the morning routines of administratum scribes, in the hands of exhausted middle-tier officials working 12-hour shifts in processing halls. Made from crushed and brewed leaves, delivering a mild stimulant effect, recognizable in form and function to anyone who has ever waited for a kettle to boil. On a civilized world, recaf is probably the first thing consumed in the morning and the last thing thought about at night. Not transcendent, not luxurious, just functional and warm and daily. A constant across the vast range of imperial world types, from the most comfortable to the most miserable. The morning on a civilized world also contains, reliably, the ecclesiarchy. The Adeptus Ministorum, the hierarchical church of the imperial cult, maintains and spreads the imperial creed across every inhabited world in the Imperium, including the ones that otherwise resemble a functional, modern civilization. Worship is a structural part of an imperial citizen's day. Prayer before work, prayer before meals, prayer in whatever downtime exists between obligations. On a civilized world where you might also have a transit commute and a banking appointment and something resembling consumer commerce, that prayer is woven into the texture of an otherwise recognizable day. Attendance at local shrines is expected. Absence draws the attention of the ecclesiarchy, and after that, the arbites. Whether that constitutes a legal mandate or an extremely strong cultural expectation with serious consequences for non-compliance is a distinction that stops mattering when the gray armored enforcers arrive. The theology behind this prayer is specific and not metaphorical. The Emperor of Mankind isn't a dead historical figure that imperial citizens venerate out of tradition. He is, in the active and literal belief of the imperial cult, an embodied divine entity, the only true God of mankind, seated wounded on the golden throne of Holy Terra, vigilant, present, and psychically sustaining the infrastructure that allows the Imperium to function at all. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes faster-than-light navigation across 1,000,000 worlds possible, runs on him. The navigation lanes that hold the Imperium together run on the Emperor's sustained consciousness. When citizens pray, they aren't performing a cultural ritual toward an absent symbol. They are maintaining a relationship with a living God who is, by any theological measure they have access to, the primary reason they are still alive. The common citizen version of this theology is compressed and direct. The Emperor fought a great evil. He was wounded. He sits on the golden throne now, ever watchful over humanity. Xenos are abominations. Chaos, known at folk level as the great enemy, the dark force beyond the veil, the thing that the Emperor holds back at psychic cost, is real, present, and spiritually dangerous. You owe the Emperor your devotion because without it, the darkness wins, and the darkness does not distinguish between the pious and the lapsed when it arrives. What this means practically is that the morning prayer isn't optional. It isn't separable from the rest of daily life the way a secular cultural practice might be. It's structural. The Emperor's continued presence on the throne, his continued capacity to sustain the psychic beacon, to hold back the warp, is understood to depend, at least in part, on the accumulated devotion of 1 billion citizens across 1,000,000 worlds. Your morning prayer isn't your private spiritual exercise. It's load-bearing. Citizens know the Emperor sits on the throne. They know he was wounded in a great war 10,000 years ago. The details of that war, that the Emperor's own genetically engineered sons led the rebellion, that half the Imperium's superhuman armies turned on him, that the wound was inflicted by his chosen heir, aren't part of the civic curriculum. The history that gets distributed to ordinary citizens is a version of history. The architecture of what is withheld is as significant as what is shared. Space Marines, they know as legends, warrior angels of the Emperor, appearing in the worst moments. Few citizens have seen one. The knowledge that these figures exist is real. The texture of what they actually are is mythological. Chaos, they know as the devil knows the theology. The specific mechanics of warp entities and ruinous powers aren't general knowledge. The emotional shape, there is an ancient spiritual enemy, It targets the weak of faith. The emperor protects the devoted, is universal. It's sufficient for daily life, which is probably the point. A hive world is what happens when a planet becomes a city. Not a city on a planet, a city that is the planet, or rather, a planet buried under cities. Continent-spanning structures built simultaneously, kilometers into the sky and deep below the ground, housing populations that might number in the hundreds of billions on a single world. Multiple hive structures on the same planet, each one a vertical megastructure entire civilizations tall, each one its own complete ecosystem of human density and human pressure and human misery, in quantities that make individual suffering difficult to even frame. The hive stratifies, almost inevitably. Extreme density and extreme resource pressure create extreme social stratification, and extreme stratification creates genuine civilizational divergence between the top and the bottom of the same structure. The underhive at the base, the midhive through most of the structure's volume, the spire at the top. Start at the bottom. The underhive is the hive city's basement, the parts that were built first, layered over as the structure grew upward, eventually cut off from the functioning maintenance systems as resources concentrated in the levels above. Power was cut decades or centuries ago in most underhive sections. The infrastructure that once maintained these lower zones, furnace stacks, maintenance shafts, lifter systems, gantries, has been repurposed, stripped, or left to the particular decay of structures that nobody is watching anymore. The people who live here are the people the hive's upper administration has found it easier to abandon than to govern. The official Forge World description of underhive diet reads with the calm of an inventory document. Food in the underhive rarely holds any joy, and most meals consist of corpse starch or Nutri-Slime, supplemented with synth fats and vitamin shots. That's the product description. Written that way because, from the administrative perspective, this is simply what is available, and nothing about it requires editorial comment. Corpse starch is processed organic matter recycled from the hive's dead. The precise origin may or may not be something underhive residents are fully informed about. Whether you find more horror in not knowing or in knowing and eating it anyway is a question worth sitting with. The Imperium doesn't particularly labor the point either way. The underhive runs on gang law. The only rule that survives in the spaces the hive authorities have abandoned is the rule of whoever enforced their will most recently and most effectively. An underhive resident's day is structured around threats and resources in a ratio so compressed they're often the same thing. The gang controlling the nearest water supply, the scavengers competing for the same recyclable material, the collapsed sublevels below with whatever inhabits them now, the occasional arbites sweep that turns the whole underhive into a locked door, held breath silence until the gray armor moves on. There is no commute in the underhive in the way the word usually means. There is movement toward what sustains you and movement away from what ends you, and the routes are the same routes. The midhive is where most people live. This is the vast majority of any hive city's population. The factory workers, the hab block residents, the low-level enforcers, the maintenance crews, the scribes, the support workforce for an industrial world that needs billions of hands to function. Their hab blocks are dense in a way that the word barely captures. Not just crowded, but architecturally, conceptually dense. Family living spaces, a fraction of anything that would register as acceptable under most pre-40,000 standards. Walls thin enough to know the respiratory patterns of adjacent families. Noise levels that never reach silence because silence doesn't exist in a mid-hive hab block. It functions. There is power. There is transit. There is, in the clinical sense of the word, infrastructure. The mid-hive commute deserves specific attention because it's genuinely unlike anything in the comparable human experience. Your hive is kilometers tall. The factory you work in might be at a completely different altitude from the hab block where you sleep, which might be at a completely different altitude from the shrine you're required to visit for prayer. Getting between any two of these points means navigating vertical infrastructure, massive elevators, gigantic vertical trains running in shafts through the structure's core, anti-grav transit systems where the technology has been maintained well enough to operate them. In a structure housing hundreds of millions of people, that infrastructure operates at pressures that make peak hour on any modern metropolitan subway system look spacious. You commute through the Hive the way you'd navigate a building, not a city. But the building is the size of a city, and every corridor is carrying the population equivalent of a medium-sized nation toward its various obligations. The lights are always artificial. They don't cycle with the sun because there is no sun inside the Hive. No sun accessible in the midhive, anyway. You live by the shift clock. The rhythm of your day is imposed by the factory schedule and the prayer schedule and the transit schedule, not by anything natural or biological. In the midhive, the sky is the next level up, which is a section of gantry work and exhaust ductwork you've never visited. This brings us to one of the most quietly devastating facts about Hive City citizens. People who have spent their entire lives inside the Hive structure respond to open sky with panic, vertigo, genuine physical disorientation. Citizens raised in the Hive, and this means the majority of Hive-worlders across generation after generation of people who never left, have been documented reacting to stars, to horizon, to open space, with responses that read as pathological from the outside. The Hive isn't where they live, it's what they are. The outside of the Hive isn't freedom, it's just a different kind of hostile environment, and one they have no cultural or neurological toolkit for navigating. Now the spire. The spire exists above the pollution bands. This is literal and significant. The midhive and underhive operate beneath toxic cloud layers generated by the industrial activity of the Hive's lower levels, and the majority of Hive residents breathe this their entire lives as an unremarked background condition. The spire sits above it. The air in the spire is breathable without filtration. It has natural light, or at least light that approximates natural light at a quality impossible in the levels below. It has space. It has the accumulated resource of a continent-spanning industrial megastructure concentrated into the living quarters of a relatively small number of people who were born into positions that made this concentration possible. The spire nobility are a distinct civilization from the people below them in a way that goes beyond wealth. They know the underhive exists the way someone might know there are ocean trenches, as an abstract geological fact with no experiential relationship to it. Their daily life is structured by servants, by servitors, the Imperium's cybernetic lobotomized labor units, repurposed for domestic service as readily as for industrial work, and by a ritual culture of status performance so elaborate that it would be recognizable across any court culture in human history. So, how long does it take a Hive noble to get dressed? This isn't a trivial question dressed up as a joke. The serious version underneath it's this. The Imperium of Man is 10,000 years of accumulated ritual, status hierarchy, theological obligation, and bureaucratic elaboration compressed into the daily existence of its ruling class. Every item of clothing carries heraldic significance. Every layering decision reflects a social position that must be accurately communicated to every other person in the room, and the consequences of miscommunication are real. The Imperial noble does not put on clothes in the morning. They assemble an argument about their position in a 10,000-year-old social order, conducted in the language of fabric and heraldry and cut. What is available is the context from which any reconstruction must follow: extreme wealth, extreme ritual culture, an established pattern of servitor use in domestic service roles, and a social environment where appearance is a form of high-stakes communication. The answer is almost certainly a very long time, involving multiple attendants and a sequence of ritual observances attached to each garment. Whether that reconstruction is exact is less important than the question it makes visible. What is the experiential texture of that morning for that person in that spire, above the pollution band, above the billions of people below them who are eating corpse starch and running for the vertical transit. 300 levels below the spire residence dressing room, someone in the midhive woke up already late. Then there are the worlds where getting dressed is an act of worship, and eating breakfast is an act of worship, and going to work is an act of worship, and the distinction between secular obligation and sacred duty has been administratively dissolved. Shrine worlds are planets consecrated entirely to the Imperial faith, not worlds that happen to have churches that happen to be planets. The physical environment, as described in campaign sources, is dense clouds of incense occluding grand spires and towering basilicas, sanctified streets echoing with constant prayer, holy scripture engraved in marble throughout the urban space. The Basilica Majoris, the central cathedral complex, functions simultaneously as the civic, economic, and theological heart of the planet. There is no separation between these categories on a shrine world. The city is the church. The economy is the church. The government is the church. More than that, shrine worlds function as psychic infrastructure. Campaign documents describe them as psychic edifices beaming out into the warp like a lighthouse, concentrated imperial faith, focused on the golden throne and the figure seated in it, broadcasting devotion as a measurable metaphysical signal. This isn't a metaphor in the 40K universe. The warp responds to consciousness and belief. A shrine world's prayer is real in the same physical sense that a Vox transmitter is real. Prayer on a shrine world isn't the morning obligation of a civilized world citizen who also has a commute and a banking appointment. On a shrine world, prayer is the day. The day is prayer. Work, for a citizen born there rather than a pilgrim visiting, is most likely some form of service to the devotional infrastructure, maintaining the basilicas, processing the pilgrims who travel for decades across the stars to reach this place, producing the devotional materials and holy goods that constitute the planet's primary export. The economy of a shrine world is the economy of faith made material. Whether the prayer schedule constitutes a legal mandate or an overwhelming cultural expectation with serious enforcement consequences is a distinction without practical difference. Missing the expected prayer draws attention from the ecclesiarchy. Attention from the ecclesiarchy can draw attention from the arbites. The lived experience of mandatory prayer is identical regardless of the technical legal framing. The imperial calendar provides specific holy days. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension on the 1st of December, the Sanguinalia on the 21st, the Imperalia running the 17th through the 23rd. On a shrine world, these dates aren't distinguishable from regular days in kind, only in intensity. Regular days already involve continuous devotion. Holy days add public ceremonies and additional formal obligations on top of the existing schedule. They aren't rest days. The Imperium does not recognize the concept of rest days in any sense that affects this. Now consider the experiential difference between a pilgrim visiting a shrine world and a person born on one. The pilgrim has context. They know there are other kinds of worlds. They know this planet is a specific, intentional thing, a place set apart, and they have made a journey, sometimes spanning decades of travel, to arrive here. The ritual intensity is the point. It's what they came for. The citizen born on a shrine world has no reference frame for anything else. They have never lived on a planet where the primary economic and social activity wasn't the management of devotion. Their sense of what a normal day looks like is structured entirely by the basilica bells, the prayer cycles, the pilgrimage calendar, the pilgrims who arrive already spiritually charged from their long journey and fill the streets with a fervor that the born citizen manages with the professional calm of someone who works in a hospital, present to suffering without being overwhelmed by it, because this is simply the environment. If you told that citizen there were planets in the Imperium where people drove vehicles to commercial spaces for non-religious purposes, the sentence wouldn't assemble into a clear image in their mind. It would be as alien to them as open sky to a hive worlder. The theological complication of shrine worlds is worth sitting with for a moment. These planets exist specifically to honor and sustain the Emperor's presence. They are psychic infrastructure for the Imperium's connection to its god. And they are, as a direct consequence of that importance, primary targets for every enemy the Imperium has. Traitor legions, the word-bearers particularly, who treat theological desecration as a military objective, target shrine worlds with documented malice. Chaos entities in the warp are drawn to the lighthouse these worlds project. A fallen shrine world isn't merely a military loss. It's a psychic weapon turned inside out, broadcasting corruption instead of devotion. Shrine worlds have been subjected to Exterminatus when they fall past the point of recovery. Not commonly, Exterminatus remains a last resort, reserved for worlds corrupted down to the soil itself, where no military or theological intervention remains viable. But it has happened. The calculus is specific. If the lighthouse is turned, the light it was casting needs to stop. In the wider fan community, this produces a reading that has genuine lore foundation, that shrine worlds exist in a state of inherent tension, high-value targets whose importance makes them simultaneously essential and exposed, whose fall is irreversible in a way that other world types' falls might not be. Whether the Emperor's eventual return, a theological expectation present in some strands of Imperial doctrine, would change the purpose and status of shrine worlds is a question nobody in the administratum has apparently filed the paperwork to address. The scenario where it becomes relevant is also the scenario where the setting has changed beyond most recognizable parameters. For now, on a shrine world in the actual 41st millennium, bells at dawn, incense so thick the Basilica district carries visible haze by mid-morning, the sound of pilgrims in queue before the sun has moved, the smell of candles and devotion, and the particular human closeness of mass worship. The same morning, every morning, for the citizens who were born here and have never known anything else. The Imperium's million worlds aren't variations on a theme. They are genuinely different categories of human existence, and the daily routines they produce are genuinely incomparable. An Agri-world citizen begins the day at whatever passes for dawn on their particular patch of a planet dedicated to food production at Imperial scale. These worlds are the Imperium's food supply, farming operations sized to feed hive cities numbering in the hundreds of billions, producing tides of agricultural output that ship off-world through a logistics network of staggering complexity. The Agri-world serf's relationship to their labor product ends at the loading bay. They grow it, it's tethered, it leaves. The hive city it feeds is, in most cases, so far away and so conceptually enormous that it exists only as an administrative obligation, not as an imaginable destination. The person who grows the food that keeps a hive city alive will likely never visit that city, may never know its name. The Imperium runs on this kind of distance, between producer and consumer, between labor and benefit, between the person doing the work and the person the work serves. Forge worlds are different in a way that goes past economics or culture. A forge world operates under mechanicus authority, not the standard administratum framework. And the mechanicus isn't a regular bureaucracy. It's a religious institution with a specific theology. The flesh is impure, the machine is holy, and the appropriate aspiration for any thinking being is the progressive replacement of organic components with mechanical augmentation. Tech adepts spend their careers incrementally becoming more machine than human, and the environment they create, the industrial theocracy of a forge world, reflects this aspiration in every physical and institutional detail. The air smells of metal and promethium. The noise is continuous, structural, never industrial background, but always industrial foreground. The daily routine of even a non-adept forge world laborer is shaped by this theology. Interface with machines, serve machines. Understand your own body as a machine running at suboptimal specification. The Emperor is worshipped here as the Omnissiah, the divine embodiment of technology rather than the paternal protector of the civilized world's morning prayer. Same God, wholly different daily relationship. Feral worlds reduce the daily routine to its bones. Planets where accumulated knowledge has been lost, where the population lives in pre-industrial conditions, facing whatever environmental or biological threats make the planet dangerous enough to be classified as feral. The Imperium knows these worlds. It sometimes harvests them for recruits. The fighters produced by a childhood of genuine subsistence in genuinely lethal conditions make capable soldiers, which is sufficient reason from the Imperium's perspective to leave the planet largely undeveloped and return periodically with transport vessels. For the people on the ground, the Imperium exists as a distant phenomenon that occasionally arrives and takes people away, and then is gone again. Day to day, the horizon doesn't matter. The immediate forest does. Death worlds are the extreme end. Catachan is the standard reference, a jungle world where the native biology has achieved a kind of predatory perfection at every trophic level, where the plants are as dangerous as the animals, where the survival rate for unprepared visitors is approximately 0. On a death world, the morning routine is waking up alive and understanding that this represents a successful outcome. The Imperium exists in these communities the way a distant empire exists for frontier people who have never seen its capital, as an abstract authority with real material consequences, most of them involving being taken somewhere else. Now, the parts of daily life that don't appear in any promotional material. On every world type, the same institutional machinery is present in different concentrations. The Adeptus Arbites, the tithe system, the Inquisition as ambient condition rather than active presence, Imperial justice in its arbitrary structural form. These aren't exceptional events that interrupt daily life. They are the architecture of daily life, and citizens navigate them the way they navigate the weather, with accommodation rather than shock. Because shock requires the belief that things could be otherwise, and most Imperial citizens have no framework for that belief. The Arbites are the Imperium's planetary law enforcement, and they aren't a police force in any contemporary sense. They don't exist to protect citizens from crime. They enforce Imperial law, specifically the regulations, tithes, and edicts that represent the Imperium's interests on the planet. And the distinction between Imperial law and local law is meaningful. A citizen experiencing theft, assault, or neighborhood violence has no particular claim on Arbites' attention. That's not their function. Their function is ensuring that the machinery of Imperial extraction runs without interference. Non-payment of tithes, non-compliance with edicts, disruption to the supply of soldiers and resources the Imperium has scheduled. These draw the gray-armored, shock-maul-carrying Arbites in ways that a murdered neighbor may not. An interaction with an Arbites patrol is an encounter with institutional authority that isn't interested in context. The Arbites aren't arbitrating. They are enforcing a set of Imperial requirements, and the enforcement is the message. The tithe system operates at such a structural level that individual citizens may not experience it as a discrete event, but as a permanent background condition of their lives. Military conscription, the levy of soldiers for the Astra Militarum, is a fact of life on most worlds. It arrives on a schedule set by the Imperium, not by the world being levied. Families absorb the loss of members to conscription the way communities absorb the loss of members to any large, recurring, externally imposed event. With grief, with practical adaptation, and with the understanding that this is simply how things are. The soldiers taken may not return. Whether they survive their deployment to whatever war zone the Imperium assigns them to isn't information routinely communicated back to their homeworld. Information is controlled in ways both obvious and invisible. Citizens don't know what they don't know. The history of the Horus Heresy, the civil war 10,000 years ago that placed the Emperor on the throne and nearly destroyed the Imperium, is public knowledge at the folk history level. There was a great war. The Emperor was wounded. He keeps watch still. The specific content of that war, the fact that the Emperor's own enhanced sons led the rebellion, the scope of what was betrayed, this isn't in the civic curriculum. What the Imperium distributes as history is a carefully maintained version of history, and the architecture of what is withheld is as structurally significant as what is shared. Psychers require special mention because the discovery of a psyker in a civilian community is perhaps the clearest illustration of how the Imperium's largest, most abstract horrors arrive in the most immediate domestic settings. A psyker is a human with a direct psychic connection to the warp. They are born into the Imperial population at a rate that makes them statistically present in any community of significant size. An untrained psyker is, in the cosmology of this universe, a genuine physical danger, not metaphorically, but structurally, a door left open in a building everyone shares. When a psyker manifests, when a neighbor's child begins displaying abilities, when the reclusive woman at the end of the corridor starts speaking in voices that don't match her own, when the lights do things lights can't do, the community's response is shaped by conditioning that runs deep enough to override most competing instincts. Report them. Don't attempt to help them yourself. Don't hide them. The black ships come for psychers, Imperial vessels moving on schedules that aren't publicly distributed, arriving to collect those who have been identified and registered. Whether those individuals survive the process, whether they're trained as sanctioned Imperial psychers, or whether they become part of the fuel supply for the Astronomicon, isn't information that flows back to the communities they came from. The black ships take. The community absorbs the absence and continues. The Inquisition operates in most civilians' lives as ambient pressure rather than active presence. An inquisitor isn't usually there, but the possibility that one might arrive, investigating heresy, mutation, warp taint, or simply a pattern that looked wrong from a distance, is always there. The person at the market yesterday who asked slightly unusual questions, the stranger who seemed too carefully uncurious about the odd sounds coming from the storage section of the hab block, the official who arrived to update registration records and stayed 30 minutes longer than the process should have required. Any of these could be. Probably none of them are. There is no reliable method for distinguishing the two cases. The result is a specific kind of social calibration that anyone familiar with life under pervasive surveillance structures would recognize. Careful language, narrow circles of trust, a finely tuned sensitivity to the direction of institutional attention. Not paranoia, pragmatism. The Inquisition has done nothing to you. You would like to maintain that record. Maintaining it requires ongoing effort. Every day, as a background process running alongside the commute and the prayer and the shift and the meal. This is Tuesday, every Tuesday for 1,000,000 worlds. The Feast of the Emperor's Ascension falls on the 1st of December in the Imperial calendar. On Shrine worlds, it's the most significant date in the devotional year. On Civilized worlds, it marks additional obligations layered onto the regular ones. Renewed duty and faith expressed through extra prayer and public ceremony. On Hive worlds, it's another shift with more prayer required at either end of it. On Agri worlds, it's a feast day with no particular surplus to feast with. On Forge worlds, it's devotion maintained alongside the maintenance of machinery, indistinguishable in practice from any other day. Every world, every citizen, every morning. Now come back to the torpedo. The Exterminatus order arrives with the force of theological certainty. The planet is beyond recovery. The corruption has gone too deep, or the military calculus is too unfavorable, or someone with authority has decided that the price of not acting is higher than the cost of the action. The paperwork is completed in High Gothic. The seals are applied. The order moves through the command chain and reaches the orbital platforms. Down on the surface, a few hours before the first torpedo reaches the upper atmosphere, someone is drinking recaf that has gone cold because they got distracted by the prayer that needed to be finished before the door could be opened. Someone is in a queue for the vertical transit, pressed into the crowd that fills the elevator shaft at shift change, running through the mental checklist of the day ahead. In the spire, someone has been dressing for over an hour, surrounded by attendants managing garments that carry the weight of 10 centuries of heraldic convention, and will spend another half hour completing the sequence. In the underhive, in the dark, someone is eating from a ration that has no taste worth registering, and thinking about nothing further than the next few hours. because projection beyond that distance requires more cognitive energy than survival budgets allow. The emperor watches from his throne, or at least that is what every one of these people believes. And in a universe where belief has measurable metaphysical weight, the distinction between believing the emperor watches and the emperor watching is smaller than it appears. The torpedo arrives with no knowledge of any of this. It does not know about the cold recaf, or the unfinished prayer, or the crowded transit, or the elaborate morning ritual of the spire, or the underhive ration. It knows velocity and target coordinates. Everything else was decided by the order, 17 seals ago, in formal High Gothic, filed under mercy. This is what Exterminatus actually is. The fire is the instrument. The interruption of a million morning routines is the act. A prayer that ends mid-word. A recaf that nobody comes back to finish. A transit that never arrives. A planet full of people who woke up that morning and did what you do when you live in the Imperium of Man. Got up, got dressed, said their prayers, and went to work. Now you know what was happening on that planet the morning before. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.